Tomorrow night at 11:30 on the $1 Million Movie, Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, and Basil Rathbone in a comedy of terrors.
Prepare yourself for a rare look at the legendary supergroup, The Doors.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day.
Do you know the warm progress under the stars? Do you know we exist? Have you forgotten the keys to the kingdom? Have you been born yet, and are you alive? Let's reinvent the gods, all the myths of the ages. Celebrate symbols from deep elder forests. Have you forgotten the lessons of the ancient war? We need great golden copulations.
In 1968, almost every American knew what these were: hippies. A few of the estimated 16 million cultural rebels who abandoned 1950s notions about how life in America should be lived. And by 1968, almost everyone in America knew what these people were too: student protesters, activists, part of a small but vocal group of political rebels who were fighting not only to end a war, but to transform, even dismantle, the American system.
We will not let them separate our culture from our politics. We are a people. We are all together. We are all under attack. America has decided to devour its youth. We will resist. We will not participate in America's Children for Breakfast program. Fuck them!
They were people who had most Americans convinced that hippies and political activists marched hand in hand. But for the most part, they never did.
God knows why. I think there must have been some sense that it's time for something new to happen, and maybe this is going to be it. The music was something that you could talk about with your friends and that you couldn't talk about with people who were older than you. It gave people a sense of generational solidarity and a sense that they were different, and a sense different from the rest of the country, different from any other generation in American history, that they were in some ways special and blessed. And it gave them a sense of being embattled, of being considered outsiders, reprobates, bad people.
I wanna be a Beatle. I never pull my hair, so I can look just like
These kids may not look like it, but they are the leading edge of a youth rebellion, a movement that would ignite one of the most powerful and pervasive cultural shifts in United States history.
You would physically get approached and, you know, called gay or fags or queers or whatever it was, a lot of people did not understand long hair at all. It was really a threat to them. It was really, it really flew in the face of conventionalism. And long hair was a flag for someone. You could see somebody across the street, and if they had long hair, you knew how they thought. You knew that they were into good music. You knew that they were into a reasonable life. You knew that their thought processes. You knew that they probably hated the government. You knew that they probably knew where the best drugs were. You knew that it was someone that you could just nod to and have this understanding between. Anybody that had really short hair, you knew what short hair meant. Strange, isn't it?
Physical desire is very normal, and it happens, and sometimes everything just comes down to a very basic level, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think that sex is just much groovier when there's love, There's a lot more happening, but there's nothing wrong with just sex for sex.
Such talk was not only provocative, but at the time, downright immoral. This generation seemed determined to tear down conventions that had, in 1950s America, defined proper behavior. And it's somewhat ironic to think that scientists would unwittingly pour gasoline on the fires by coming up with the surest contraceptive ever devised. Fear of pregnancy, perhaps the most powerful sexual restraint, was undone.
Keep up the grass, the sign says, keep up the grass. Keep up the grass, the sign says, keep up.
Use of another drug, marijuana, would further separate members of this generation not only from their parents, but also from their inhibitions.
Love me 2 times, baby. Love me twice today. Love me 2 times, girl. I'm gone away. Love me 2 times, girl. 1 for tomorrow, 1 just for today. Love me 2 times. I'm gone away. Love me 1 time, could not speak. Love me 1 time, yeah, my knees got weak. Love me 2 times, girl. Lost me all through the week. Love me 2 times, I've gone away. Love me 2 times, I've gone away. Oh, yeah. Love me 1 time, could not speak. Love me 1 time, baby. Yeah, my knees got weak. Love me 2 times, girl. Lost me all through the week. Love me 2 times, I'm gone away. Love me 2 times, babe. Love me twice today. Love me 2 times, babe. 'Cause I'm going away. Love me 2 times, girl. 1 for tomorrow, 1 just for today. Love me 2 times, I'm going away. Love me 2 times, I'm going away. Love me 2 times, I'm going away.
In high school, my girlfriend Ann and I went around with Jim and Bob. They both smoked pot. That's jive talk for marijuana. Bad.
Around this time, millions of young people tried marijuana or knew someone who did. In response, films like this were shown in schools to curtail the growing marijuana problem. But students who saw these films knew that most marijuana smokers weren't going crazy or becoming heroin addicts, so many kids concluded they were being lied to, and they'd have to find the truth for themselves, even if it meant breaking the law.
During the time, was the rock and roll that inspired by drugs, or was it, just good music?
No, the rock and roll was not inspired by drugs. And it wasn't drugs. Today it's drugs. It's cocaine and crack, and that's drugs. Heroin is drugs. All the people were doing back in the 60s was smoking the herb. It was just hemp. It was just a mild intoxicant that would open the doors of perception. They weren't drugs. Drugs are the pills and the junk that people are taking today. All we were doing was opening the doors of perception. And that's where the music came from. That's where the name The Doors came from. The Beatles had opened the doors of their perception. When that album Rubber Soul came out, you could see that the Beatles, you could see in their eyes, the Beatles had ingested the sacred mushroom or something very much like it. And it was a whole different consciousness. It was a consciousness, an expansion of consciousness.
Uncertainty was not something parents wanted to hear from their children. Parents, after all, had worked hard to direct their kids along the smoothest path to success. But with ever-increasing numbers of young people exploring alternative directions, the fundamental cultural tension of the era emerged. It came to be called the generation gap. In the 1960s, this belief that happiness could be a goal in itself would take on historical significance.
Is being happy? What does it mean?
Let me put it this way to you. Do you think this country, at this time, needs something that it hasn't got?
Yes.
What does it need?
Love. The whole people have to know each other, you know?
What about people older than, say, 30? Older people, do you think they can indulge in this too?
Yes, they should.
Do they?
I don't know if they do, but they should.
What do you think older people think of all this?
Most of them think it's ridiculous.
Why do you think they think it's ridiculous?
Because I don't think it can be done.
Be happy, love one another. Age-old concepts, but at a time of unprecedented affluence, a time when much of society was still clinging to 1950s conformities, most importantly, a time when the massive baby boom generation was coming of age, these concepts would emerge as the guiding doctrines of a values revolution, what would come to be known as the counterculture.
What a lot of the members of the counterculture came to see was that changing people's cultural values may have to do with changing their state of consciousness. And hence you get this fascination with anything that will change people's mode of perception, open the doors of perception, right? It could be drugs. The fascination with drugs was not fun and games in the 60s. For many people, it was a way to see reality differently, and hopefully, therefore, to change your values.
Here's one of the truly fateful twists in this tale of cultural rebellion. A collision that put the most potent psychochemical ever invented, LSD, into the hands of millions of young people passionately searching for something new. LSD was only vaguely understood by the most qualified researchers. What was LSD doing to these people?
Did you ever, I only ask this because you mentioned it, then you didn't play on the stage whilst, you know, on the LSD.
No.
Had you experienced to the extent where you realised that you just couldn't do that?
Well, it's not something that you take and then go play a gig. It's something that you take and go to the ocean and experience the water, the sun, your mother, the water, the sun, your father in the sky, you on planet Earth. That's what it's about. Yeah. Where am I? I am on a globe, and that globe is spinning around the universe, you know, around our sun. You have to, those are the things you realize on LSD. You bring that then and put that into your music.
Aldous Huxley.
I think it's quite on the cards that we may have drugs which will profoundly change our mental states without doing us any harm. I mean, this is the pharmacological revolution which has taken place.
The man behind the dystopian novel Brave New World was an avid proponent of LSD and psychedelic drugs during the 40s and 50s. The British writer even documented the mind-altering effects of mescaline in his book The Doors of Perception. However, it was perhaps Aldous Huxley's last request that really demonstrated the importance of these drugs in his life. While dying of cancer, he asked his wife to inject him with LSD.
This was a question that the authorities were very interested in. Everybody that took LSD felt that they were undergoing enormous personal changes. They weren't the same person after having LSD. And there was a scientific study. It was done by a Rand scientist. And in 1966, he published his findings, and what he said was, even though all of these people said that they felt enormous changes had taken place, the personality test showed that they were largely the same person in every area but one area. And this was called the Ways to Live scale. The Ways to Live scale indicated that one dose of LSD stimulated enormous changes, whereas the person taking the test might have said, it's important for me to get a corporate job, it's important for me to have a good car. After one dose of LSD, they were saying, I think maybe a contemplative lifestyle might be what I want to have. I think I'd like to travel before settling down. I think maybe I want to look for some spiritual value in my life. Things totally changed around.
The LSD trip is best understood as a religious pilgrimage. The LSD kick.
Timothy Leary was the psychedelic movement's prophet of perception, a high-profile LSD advocate who was scaring the hell out of mainstream America.
Sense in the Declaration of Independence said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness means the right to get high. The morals of this country have changed. The kids just don't buy that whole uptight, keep your legs crossed, Puritan ethic. The aim of the game is to feel good. And the function of government is to get everyone high and feel good. It's odorless, colorless, tasteless.
Leary was alarming because he was proposing to radically alter fundamental institutions. He was terrifying because it seemed like some of America's best and brightest young people were listening to him.
I took a hit of Osley White Lightning acid, and I became an instant hippie.
The Council for a Summer of Love proclaims a summer of love in the city of San Francisco. We believe that Haight-Ashbury is the focus of a universal spiritual awakening. The Summer of Love is an expression of this awakening. We call upon the world to help us celebrate the infinite holiness of life.
Love my girl. She looking good. Come on. One more. 5 to 1, baby. 1 in 5. No one here gets out alive now. You get yours, baby. I'll get mine. Gonna make it, baby, if we try.
This city has gained the reputation of being the hippie capital of the world.
May take a week and it may take longer. They got the guns, but we got the numbers. Gonna win, yeah, we're taking over. Come on! Your ballroom days are over, baby. Night is drawing near. Shadows of the evening crawl across the hills. You walk across the floor with the flower in your hand, trying to tell me no one understands. Trading your hours for a handful of dimes. Gonna make it, baby, in our prime. Come together one more time.
Pastimes of the hippies, besides taking drugs, or partying. seminars and groups of discussion.
Get together. Get together one more time. 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 Get
Come on, honey. Go along home and wait for me, baby. I'll be there in just a little while. You see, I gotta go out in this car with these people.
Get together one more time. Get together one more time. Get together, got to get together, got to get together, got to take up in the mountains and love my girl. She looking good, looking real good. Love you. Come on. Be baby. Come on.
Come on. Now back to our regular programming.
Here is a person who few Americans could have imagined at the start of the decade. A person with no reverence for traditional concepts of sexual restraint, gender role, marriage, nuclear family, civil and religious authority. The Youth Rebellion shocked traditional America not only because such ideas had become possible, but because so many individuals had chosen to live by them. The Youth Rebellion had forged an environment of unrestrained freedom, and there seemed to be no end in sight.
The death of Jim Morrison, of Tim Buckley, it shakes you to your core, because there, but for the grace of God, go I. It's a very fragile life.
The concept was that life was there to be experienced fully, to experience everything. Have no fear, make no plans, make no career plans. Test and enjoy the limits of life.